One cannot travel far in spiritual circles without meeting people who are fascinated by the, quote, near-death experience, abbreviated as NDE. The phenomenon has been described as follows. Frequently recurring features include feelings of peace and joy, a sense of being out of one's body and watching events going on around one's body, and occasionally at some distant physical location. A cessation of pain, seeing a dark tunnel or void, seeing an unusually bright light, sometimes experienced as a, quote, being of light that radiates love and may speak or otherwise communicate with the person. Encountering other beings, often deceased persons whom the experiencer recognizes. Experiencing a revival of memories, or even a full life review, sometimes accompanied by feelings of judgment. Seeing some other realm, often of great beauty. Sensing a barrier or border beyond which the person cannot go, and returning to the body, often reluctantly. Such accounts have led many people to believe that consciousness must be independent of the brain. However, these experiences vary across cultures, and no single feature is common to them all. One would think that if a non-physical domain were truly being explored, some universal characteristics would stand out. Hindus and Christians would not substantially disagree, and one certainly wouldn't expect the after-death state of South Indians to diverge from that of North Indians, as has been reported. It should also trouble NDE enthusiasts that only 10 to 20% of people who approach clinical death recall having any experience at all. But the deepest problem with drawing sweeping conclusions about the NDE is that those who have had one and subsequently talked about it did not die. Indeed, many of them appear to have been in no actual danger of dying. And those who have reported leaving their bodies during a true medical emergency, after cardiac arrest for instance, did not suffer a complete loss of brain activity. Even in cases where the brain is alleged to have shut down, its activity must return if the subject is to survive and describe the experience. In such cases, there is generally no way to establish that the NDE occurred while the brain was offline. Many students of the NDE claim that certain people left their bodies and perceived the commotion surrounding their near death, the efforts of hospital staff to resuscitate them, details of surgery, the grief of family members. Some subjects even say that they learned facts while traveling beyond their bodies that would otherwise have been impossible to know. For instance, a secret told by a dead relative, the truth of which was later confirmed. Reports of this kind seem especially vulnerable to self-deception, if not deliberate fraud. There's yet another problem, however. Even if true, such phenomenon might suggest only that the human mind possesses powers of extrasensory perception, clairvoyance or telepathy, for instance. This would be an astonishing discovery, but it wouldn't demonstrate the survival of death. Why? Because unless we could know that a subject's brain was not functioning when the impressions were formed, the involvement of the brain must be presumed. What is needed to establish the mind's independence from the brain is a case in which a person has an experience, of anything, without associated brain activity. From time to time, someone will claim that a specific NDE meets this criterion. One of the most celebrated cases in the literature involves a woman, Pam Reynolds, who underwent a procedure known as hypothermic cardiac arrest, in which her core body temperature was brought down to 60 degrees, her heart was stopped, and blood flow to her brain was suspended so that a large aneurysm in her basilar artery could be repaired. Reynolds reports having had a classic NDE, complete with an awareness of the details of her surgery. Her story presents several problems, however. The events in the world that Reynolds claims to have witnessed during her NDE occurred either before she was, quote, clinically dead, or after blood circulation had been restored to her brain. In other words, despite the extraordinary details of the procedure, we have every reason to believe that Reynolds' brain was functioning when she had her experiences. Also, her case wasn't published until several years after it occurred, and its author, Dr. Michael Sabom, is a born-again Christian who had been working for decades to substantiate the otherworldly significance of the NDE. The possibility that experimenter bias, witness tampering, however unconscious, and false memories intruded into this best of all recorded cases is painfully obvious. The latest NDE to receive wide acclaim was featured on the cover of Newsweek magazine. Quote, "Heaven is real, a doctor's experience of the afterlife." The great novelty of this case is that its subject, Eben Alexander, is a neurosurgeon who we might presume is competent to judge the scientific significance of his experience. Alexander also wrote a book, Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife, which became an instant bestseller. As it happens, it displaced one of the best-selling books of the past decade, Heaven is for Real, yet another account of the afterlife, based on the near-death adventures of a 4-year-old son of a minister. Unsurprisingly, the two books offer incompatible views of what awaits us beyond the prison of the brain. Colorful as his account is, Alexander neglects to tell us that Jesus rides a rainbow-colored horse, or that the souls of dead children must still do homework in heaven. At the time of this writing, Alexander's book is ranked number 1 on the New York Times paperback bestseller list, and it has been on the list for 56 weeks. The psychologist Raymond Moody, who coined the phrase near-death experience, called Alexander's account, quote, "the most astounding I have heard in more than 4 decades of studying this phenomenon. He is living proof of an afterlife." Well then, prepare to be astounded. Once upon a time, a neurosurgeon named Ibn Alexander contracted a bad case of bacterial meningitis and fell into a coma. While immobile in his hospital bed, he experienced visions of such intense beauty that they changed everything, not just for him, but for all of us, and for science as a whole. According to Alexander, his experience proves that consciousness is independent of the brain, that death is an illusion, and that heaven exists, complete with the usual angels, clouds, and departed relatives, but also butterflies and beautiful girls in peasant dress. Our current understanding of the mind, quote, "now lies broken at our feet, for, as Alexander declares, what happened to me destroyed it, and I intend to spend the rest of my life investigating the true nature of consciousness and making the fact that we are more, much more than our physical brains as clear as I can, both to my fellow scientists and to people at large." It should be clear from the preceding chapters that unlike many scientists and philosophers, I remain agnostic on the question of how consciousness is related to the physical world. There are good reasons to believe that it is an emergent property of brain activity, just as the rest of the human mind is. But we know nothing about how such a miracle of emergence might occur. And if consciousness were irreducible, or even separable from the brain in a way that would give comfort to St. Augustine, my worldview would not be overturned. I know that we do not understand consciousness, and nothing that I think I know about the cosmos, or about the patent falsity of most religious beliefs, requires that I deny this. So although I am an atheist who can be expected to be critical of religious dogma, I'm not reflexively hostile to claims of the sort Alexander has made. In principle, my mind is open. It really is. However, almost nothing about Alexander's account withstands scrutiny, and this is especially insidious given that he claims to be a scientist. Many of his errors are glaring but immaterial. In his book, for instance, he understates the estimated number of neurons in the human brain by a factor of 10. Others are utterly damning to his case. Whatever his qualifications on paper, Alexander's evangelizing about his experience in coma is so devoid of intellectual sobriety, to say nothing of rigor, that I would see no reason to engage with it if it were not for the fact that his book has been read and believed by millions of people. One of the greatest obstacles I see to our fashioning a rational approach to spirituality is to have religious superstition and self-deception masquerade as science. Hence it is worth considering Alexander's case in detail. First, there are some troubling signs that the good doctor is just another casualty of American-style Christianity. For though he claims to have been a non-believer before his adventures in coma, he offers the following self-portrait. Although I considered myself a faithful Christian, I was so more in name than in actual belief. I didn't begrudge those who wanted to believe that Jesus was simply more than a good man who suffered at the hands of the world. I sympathized deeply with those who wanted to believe that there was a God somewhere out there who loved us unconditionally. In fact, I envied such people the security that those beliefs no doubt provided. But as a scientist, I simply knew better than to believe them myself. What it means to be a faithful Christian without actual belief is not spelled out. But few non-believers will be surprised that our hero's scientific skepticism proves no match for his religious conditioning. Most of us have been around this block often enough to know that many, quote, former atheists, like Francis Collins, spent so long on the brink of faith and yearned for its emotional consolations with such vampiric intensity that the slightest breeze could send them hurtling into the abyss. For Collins, you may recall, all it took to establish the divinity of Jesus and the coming resurrection of the dead was the sight of a frozen waterfall. As we will see, Alexander seems to have required a ride on a psychedelic butterfly. In either case, it's not the perception of beauty we should begrudge, but the utter absence of intellectual seriousness with which the author interprets it. Everything in Alexander's account rests on his repeated and unwarranted assertion that his visions of heaven occurred while his cerebral cortex was, quote, shut down, inactivated, completely shut down, totally offline, and stunned to complete inactivity. He claims that the cessation of cortical activity was, quote, clear from the severity and duration of my meningitis and from the global cortical involvement documented by CT scans and neurological examinations. To his editors, this presumably sounded like science. Unfortunately, the evidence Alexander offers, in the article, in a subsequent response to my public criticism of it, in his book, and in multiple interviews, suggests that he doesn't understand what would constitute compelling evidence for his central claim of cortical inactivity. The proof he offers is either fallacious, CT scans do not measure brain activity, or irrelevant. It does not matter, even slightly, that his form of meningitis was, quote, astronomically rare. And no combination of fallacy and irrelevancy adds up to sound science. Alexander makes no reference to functional data that might have been acquired by fMRI, PET, or EEG, nor does he seem to realize that this is the sort of evidence necessary to support his case. The impediment to taking Alexander's claims seriously can be simply stated. There is no reason to believe that his cerebral cortex was inactive at the time he had his experience of the afterlife. The fact that Alexander thinks he has demonstrated otherwise, by continually emphasizing how sick he was, the infrequency of cases of E. coli meningitis, and the ugliness of his initial CT scan, suggests a deliberate disregard for the most plausible interpretation of his experience. Apparently, Alexander's cortex is functioning now. He has, after all, written a book, so whatever structural damage appeared on CT could not have been, quote, global. Otherwise, he would be making the quite crazy claim that his entire cortex was destroyed and then grew back. Coma is not associated with the complete cessation of cortical activity in any case. In fact, neuroimaging studies suggest that comatose patients, like patients under general anesthesia, have 50 to 70% of the normal level of cortical activity. And to my knowledge, almost no one thinks that consciousness is purely a matter of what happens in the cortex. Why doesn't Alexander know these things? He is, after all, a neurosurgeon, who now claims to be upending the scientific worldview on the basis of the fact that his cortex was totally quiescent at the precise moment he was enjoying the best day of his life in the company of angels. Even if his entire cortex did truly shut down, again, an incredible claim, how can he know that his visions didn't occur in the minutes and hours after its functions returned? The very fact that Alexander remembers his NDE suggests that the cortical and subcortical structures necessary for memory formation were active at the time. How else could he recall the experience? Not only does Alexander appear ignorant of the relevant science, he doesn't realize how many people have experienced visions similar to his while under the influence of psychedelics such as DMT or anesthetics such as ketamine. In fact, he has said that any suggestion of similarity between the effect of such compounds on the brain and his experience is, quote, not even in the right ballpark. But here is Alexander's description of the afterlife, as told in an interview. I was a speck on a beautiful butterfly wing, millions of other butterflies around us. We were flying through blooming flowers, blossoms on trees, and they were all coming out as we flew through them. There were waterfalls, pools of water, indescribable colors. And above there were these arcs of silver and gold light and beautiful hymns coming down from them. Indescribably gorgeous hymns. I later came to call them angels, those arcs of light in the sky. I think that word is probably fairly accurate. Then we went out of this universe. I remember just seeing everything receding, and initially I felt as if my awareness was in an infinite black void. It was very comforting, but I could feel the extent of the infinity, and that it was, as you would expect, impossible to put into words. I was there with that divine presence. There was not anything that I could visibly see and describe, and with a brilliant orb of light. They said that there were many things that they would show me, and they continued to do that. In fact, the whole higher dimensional multiverse was this incredibly complex, corrugated ball, and all these lessons were coming into me about it. Part of the lessons involved becoming all that I was being shown. It was indescribable. Not even in the right ballpark? His experience sounds so much like a DMT trip that we are not only in the right ballpark, we are talking about the stitching on the same ball. Everything that Alexander describes about his experience, including the parts I have left out, has been reported by DMT users. The similarity is uncanny. Here's how Terence McKenna described the prototypical DMT trance. Under the influence of DMT, the world becomes an Arabian labyrinth, a palace, a more than possible Martian jewel, vast with motifs that flood the gaping mind with complex and wordless awe. Color and the sense of a reality-unlocking secret nearby pervade the experience. There's a sense of other times, and of one's own infancy, and of wonder, and more wonder. It is an audience with the alien nuncio. In the midst of this experience, apparently at the end of human history, guarding gates that seem surely to open onto the howling maelstrom of the unspeakable emptiness between the stars, is the Aeon. The Aeon, as Heraclitus presciently observed, is a child at play with colored balls. Many diminutive beings are present there, the Tykes, the self-transforming machine elves of hyperspace. Are they children destined to be father to the man? One has the impression of entering into an ecology of souls that lies beyond the portals of what we naively call death. I do not know. Are they the synesthetic embodiment of ourselves as the other, or of the other as ourselves? Are they the elves lost to us since the fading magic light of childhood? Here is a tremendum barely to be told, an epiphany beyond our wildest dreams. Here is the realm of that which is stranger than we can suppose. Here is the mystery, alive, unscathed, still as new for us as when our ancestors lived it 15,000 summers ago. The tryptamine entities offer the gift of new language. They sing in pearly voices that rain down as colored petals and flow through the air like hot metal to become toys and such gifts as gods would give their children. The sense of emotional connection is terrifying and intense. The mysteries revealed are real, and if ever fully told, will leave no stone standing upon another in this small world we have gone so ill in. This is not the mercurial world of the UFO, to be invoked from lonely hilltops. This is not the siren song of lost Atlantis, wailing through the trailer courts of crack-crazed America. DMT is not one of our irrational illusions. I believe that what we experience in the presence of DMT is real news. It is a nearby dimension, frightening, transformative, and beyond our powers to imagine, and yet to be explored in the usual way. We must send fearless experts, whatever that may come to mean, to explore and to report on what they find. Alexander believes that his brain could not have produced his visions because they were too intense, too hyper-real, too beautiful, too interactive, and too drenched in significance for a brain to conjure. He also thinks that his visions could not have arisen in the minutes or hours during which his cortex, which surely never went off, switched back on. But he has simply ignored what people with working brains experience under the influence of psychedelics. And he does not appear to know that visions of the sort that McKenna describes, although they may seem to last for ages, require only a brief span of biological time. Unlike LSD and other long-acting psychedelics, DMT alters consciousness for only a few minutes. Alexander would have had more than enough time to experience a visionary ecstasy as he was coming out of his coma, whether or not his cortex was rebooting. Alexander knows that DMT already exists in the brain as a neurotransmitter. Did his brain experience a surge of DMT release during his coma? In his book, he discounts this possibility by reiterating the unfounded claim upon which his entire account rests. DMT would require a functioning cortex upon which to act, whereas his cortex, quote, wasn't available to be affected. Similar experiences can be had with ketamine, a surgical anesthetic that is occasionally used to protect a traumatized brain. Did Alexander by any chance receive ketamine while in the hospital? Did he have some other anesthetic that might produce a similar spectrum of effects at low doses? Would he even think it relevant if he had? His assertion that a psychedelic like DMT, or an anesthetic like ketamine, could not, quote, explain the kind of clarity, the rich interactivity, the layer upon layer of understanding he experienced, is perhaps the most amazing thing he has said since returning from heaven. Such compounds are universally understood to do the job. And most scientists believe that the reliable effects of psychedelics indicate that the brain is at the very least involved in the production of visionary states of the sort that Alexander is talking about. The knowledge of the afterlife that Alexander claims to possess also depends upon some extraordinarily dubious methods of verification. While in his coma, he saw a beautiful girl riding beside him on the wing of a butterfly. We learn in his book that he developed his recollection of this experience over a period of months, writing, thinking about it, and mining it for new details. It would be hard to imagine a better way to engineer a distortion of memory. Alexander also tells us that he had a biological sister he never met, who died some years before his coma. Seeing her picture for the first time after his recovery, he judged this woman to be the girl who had joined him for the butterfly ride. He sought further confirmation of this by speaking with his biological family, from whom he learned that his dead sister had indeed always been, quote, very loving. QED. As I've said throughout this book, I have spent much of my life studying and seeking experiences of the kind that Alexander describes. I haven't contracted meningitis, thankfully, nor have I had an NDE, but I have experienced many of the phenomena that often lead people to believe in the supernatural. For instance, I once had an opportunity to study with the great Tibetan Lama Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche in Nepal. Before making the trip, I had a dream in which he seemed to give me teachings about the nature of the mind. The dream struck me as interesting for two reasons. The teachings I received were novel, useful, and convergent with what I later understood to be true. And I had never met Khyentse Rinpoche, nor was I aware of having seen a photograph of him. This preceded my access to the internet by at least 5 years, so the belief that I had never seen his picture was more plausible than it would be now. I also recall that I had no easy way of finding a picture of him for the sake of comparison. But because I was about to meet the man himself, it seemed that I would be able to confirm whether he had really been in my dream. First, the teachings. The Lama in my dream began by asking who I was. I responded by telling him my name. Apparently, this wasn't the answer he was looking for. "Who are you?" he said again. He was now staring fixedly into my eyes and pointing at my face with an outstretched finger. I did not know what to say. "Who are you?" he said again, continuing to point. "Who are you?" he said a final time, but here he suddenly shifted his gaze and pointing finger, as though he were now addressing someone just to my left. The effect was quite startling, because I knew, insofar as one can be said to know anything in a dream, that we were alone. The Lama was pointing to someone who wasn't there, and I suddenly noticed what I would later understand to be an important truth about the nature of the mind. Subjectively speaking, there's only consciousness and its contents. There's no inner self who is conscious. The sense of looking over one's own shoulder, as it were, is an illusion. The Lama in my dream seemed to dissect this very feeling of being a self, and for a brief moment removed it from my mind. I awoke convinced that I had glimpsed something quite profound. After traveling to Nepal and encountering the arresting figure of Khyentse Rinpoche instructing hundreds of monks from atop a brocade throne, I was struck by the sense that he really did resemble the man in my dream. Even more apparent, however, was the fact that I couldn't know whether this impression was veridical. No doubt it would have been more fun to believe that something magical had occurred, and that I had been singled out for some sort of transpersonal initiation. But the allure of this belief suggested only that the bar for proof should be raised rather than lowered. And even though I had no formal scientific training at that point, I knew that human memory is unreliable under conditions of this kind. How much stock could I put in the feeling of familiarity? Was I accurately recalling the face of a man I had met in a dream, or was I engaged in a creative reconstruction of it? If nothing else, the experience of déjà vu proves that one's sense of having experienced something previously can jump the tracks of genuine recollection. My travels in spiritual circles also brought me into contact with many people who seemed all too eager to deceive themselves about experiences of this kind, and I did not wish to emulate them. Given these considerations, I did not believe that Khyentse Rinpoche had really appeared in my dream, and I certainly would never have been tempted to use this experience as conclusive proof of the supernatural. I invite you to compare this attitude to the one that Dr. Eben Alexander will most likely exhibit before crowds of credulous people for the rest of his life. The structure of our experiences was similar. We were each given an opportunity to compare a face remembered from a dream or vision with a person or photo in the physical world. I realized that the task was hopeless. Alexander believes that he has made the greatest discovery in the history of science. Again, nothing can be said against Alexander's experience, and such ecstasies do tell us something about how good a human mind can feel. The problem is that the conclusions Alexander has drawn from his experience, as a scientist, he continually reminds us, are based on flagrant errors in reasoning and misunderstandings of the relevant science. The enthusiastic reception Alexander has enjoyed also suggests a general confusion about the nature of scientific authority. Much of the criticism I've received for dismissing his account focuses on what appear to be his impeccable scientific credentials. However, when debating the validity of evidence and arguments, the point is never that one person's credentials trump another's. Credentials merely offer a rough indication of what a person is likely to know, or should know. If Alexander were drawing reasonable scientific conclusions from his experience, he wouldn't need to be a neuroscientist to be taken seriously. He could be a philosopher or a coal miner. But he simply isn't thinking like a scientist, and so not even a string of Nobel Prizes would shield him from criticism. Such is the perennial problem with reports of this kind. Some people are so desperate to interpret the NDE as proof of an afterlife that even those whom one would expect to have a strong commitment to scientific reasoning toss their better judgment out the window. The truth is that whatever happens after death, it is possible to justify a life of spiritual practice and self-transcendence without pretending to know things we do not know.